The question is that this House do now adjourn. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to bring forward this extremely important debate tonight on school expulsions and the link to youth violence. As the Minister and other honourable members will hopefully be aware, I am chair of the Cross-Party Youth Violence Commission. I established a commission in 2016 as a response to an alarming increase in deaths among young people in my constituency, in London and across the country. And we published our initial policy recommendations in July 2018. Now, many times in this House, I have called for the development of a public health policy to tackle violence and was pleased to see the Government and the Mayor of London commit to this approach at the end of last year. The Commission is now working hard to ensure that those words turn into action, and I'm pleased that the Mayor of London has established a violence reduction unit similar to the one adopted in Scotland to develop this approach, and I'm still waiting to see what the Government is doing. But as part of the ongoing work of the Commission, we are fleshing out some of our individual policy recommendations. And I would like to use this adjournment debate to focus on recommendation number 4 from the report, boosting support in schools. And more specifically, I'll be examining the relationship between exclusions and violence and the role of pupil referral units and alternative provision. Now, this is in no way intended to be an anti-Prue debate. During my time with the Commission, I have some brilliantly run Prues which achieve great outcomes for many of their students. However, I do believe that we need a radical rethink of the way in which funding is organised so that we can prevent the need for Prues in the first place. Now, I hope the Minister's had time to read the Commission's report for himself, as the Honourable Member for Chatham and Aylesford clearly had when she responded to my adjournment debate on the role of youth services in tackling violence. I was pleased also to see in today's press that she is continuing to stand up for vulnerable young people by criticising her government's delay in bringing forward a law to make it illegal for sports coaches to have sexual relations with 16 and 17-year-olds in the care. Mr. Speaker, the number of pupils being permanently excluded from schools is on the rise. Between 2012-13 and 2016-17, the number increased by 67%. Referrals to children's services where gangs are identified as a factor at assessment rose by 26% between 2015-16 and 2016-17. And during the same period, hospital admissions for under 18s who have been assaulted with a sharp object rose by 20%. Yep.
Honourable Lady for giving way, and she's brought a very important issue to the House for consideration. Does the Honourable Lady agree that 72% the stats show of parents think that when their child is excluded from school that they are at risk of youth violence? And this would indicate a real concern by parents of the problems that follow exclusion from school. And would the Honourable Lady not further agree that this concern must be addressed to ensure that there is life and a place to go after exclusion? I agree with the comments of the Honourable Member, and I think therein lies one of our problems, that when kids are seen to be excluded, they're not just excluded from school, but they can sometimes feel like they're absolutely excluded from society as well. Now, I'll move back onto my point in terms of the figures and the statistics and why I believe that this is so incredibly concerning, particularly given that the government's own serious violence strategy recognises school exclusions as one of the risk factors for involvement in serious violence. Yeah.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for bringing this debate in the first place and for her generosity in giving way. On stats and figures, in Croydon, we looked at the 60 serious cases of youth violence, and there was an analysis done of those 60 cases, and in every single case that child was outside of mainstream school. And yet in Croydon we also have a situation which I think is mirrored elsewhere, where some schools seem to exclude huge numbers, and some schools tend to not at all, and the disparity is clearly something has gone wrong in the system. Will she agree with me that I think we need to look at what Ofsted and what other organisations can do to try and stop so many exclusions happening in certain schools?
I thank the Honourable Member for her intervention, and I'd also like to say that the work that's gone and taken place in Croydon has been absolutely fantastic in really truly identifying the need to go and follow the evidence. You know, and the evidence clearly pointed to the link between school exclusions and youth violence, and I think that that was really important, and it is important that we always continue to follow the evidence. Now, in my constituency of Lewisham Deptford, I've known of 10 young people who've been killed as a result of violence since I was first elected in 2015. And these are the ones that we know about because they've been reported in the press or their families have contacted me. And it should not come as a surprise to members of this House that certain groups of children are more likely to be excluded and end up being educated in alternative provision settings. According to the Institute for Policy Public Research's 2017 report, Making a Difference, Breaking the Link Between School Exclusions, excluded pupils are many more times more likely to come from a vulnerable background when compared to the general student population. They are 10 times more likely to suffer from mental health problems, 7 times more likely to have a special educational need, 4 times more likely to qualify for free school meals, and twice as likely to be in the care of the state. And what about the outcomes for these young people? Now, the Commission's research has shown that it's difficult to separate out pupil referral units from data on alternative provision settings, which include those that provide education for children who cannot attend a mainstream school for other reasons. But the data that we do have makes for depressing reading. In 2016-17, only 4.5% of children educated in alternative provision settings achieved a 9-4 pass in GCSE English and Maths. And for those that don't know what that is, in old money, that's A to C's. By comparison, 72.4% of the mainstream school population in England achieved a pass in English literature and 70.7% in maths. Reintegration into mainstream might also be used as a measure of success. However, the Education Select Committee's 2018 report, Forgotten Children, Alternative Provision and the Scandal of Ever-Increasing Exclusions, suggests that this is often not a possible outcome for pupils, with some schools being reluctant to reintegrate pupils. Now, although some proofs provide support for pupils who are reintegrated, this does not apply across the board. Where pupils are reintegrated without that support, schools can struggle to keep them in school and they are likely to return to alternative provision. And once they leave the pupil referral unit, the picture remains even more bleak. A 2012 Ministry of Justice study found that 42% of prisoners reported having been permanently excluded from school, rising to 63% for temporary exclusions. Now, this provides a stark contrast to the less than 1% of the general population in England who end up in prison. Right, the same Education Select Committee report that found that 94% of Year 11 pupils from a mainstream or special school go to a sustained education or employment or training destination. Compare this to 57% from alternative provision. And this has had the knock-on effect that pupils from alternative provision face limited choices when they do leave education. Of course, it is not inevitable that pupils who have been excluded will go on to become involved in serious violence and crime. However, we cannot ignore the link between school expulsion and social exclusion. Once children and young people are permanently excluded, it's very difficult for them to re-enter mainstream education. And this often means they are more vulnerable by grooming by criminals and to becoming the victims or perpetrators of violent crime. So, what are pupil referral units costing us? The answer is not extremely straightforward. Each place receives £10,000 of central government funding, but this is topped up by local authorities to varying degrees and dependent on each individual's needs. In answer to a written question I tabled, the Department for Education estimates the average per pupil cost of alternative provision, including PRUs, to be £17,000 nationally. Now, by way of an example, the average cost of a place at Abbey Manor College, the PRU local to my constituency, is £18,000. This was £1,000 per year more than the average cost of a place in a private school in 2018, and almost 3 times the cost of a state secondary school place in the same year. Now, as part of our research, the Youth Violence Commission held 5 evidence sessions. At the third of these, we heard from experts, teachers, practitioners, and most importantly, young people themselves about the vital role that education can play in the prevention of youth violence. But what shape should that role take? Our interim report made 5 recommendations in this area. The first, and perhaps the most important of these, was a long-term aspiration of 0 expulsions from mainstream education and a reallocation of funding away from PRUs towards support and earlier intervention in mainstream schools. But in order to achieve this, schools must be properly incentivised to keep pupils on their books. The launch of Ofsted's consultation on its new framework for the inspection of schools and colleges offers some hope that things may be starting to move in the right direction. The proposals aim to address concerns that education has become too narrowly focused on exam results, and schools that push out less able children, a practice known as off-rolling, could now risk being punished by inspectors. However, it is clear that there remains a great deal to be done if we are to achieve this necessary shift in focus. Our report also recommended an overhaul of the way careers advice is delivered in schools to ensure greater inclusion, a greater emphasis on high-quality sex and relationship education, better integration of support services such as school nurses, social workers and mental health professionals in schools. Now, we had our recommendations, but we needed to test them on the professionals. So earlier this month, I met with the representatives from 5 teaching unions. And I have to admit that I had been expecting some pushback against the Commission's recommendations. Teaching, as we all know, is already a demanding and stressful job, and I feared that the unions would view them as adding more pressure to their already overworked members. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to report that I could not have been more wrong. What I learned was that there was a huge appetite and enthusiasm for teachers to be able to do more to help vulnerable pupils. However, they simply lack the time and resources. Right, so 4 main strands came out of our discussions. Firstly, we need to learn from what worked in the past. In 2002, the Labour government set up the Behavioural Improvement Programme as part of its street crime initiatives. The programme targeted 34 local authorities with some of the highest crime rates, worked with 2 to 4 secondary schools in each area and their feeder primaries, and its behaviour and education support teams provided a full range of specialist support to vulnerable pupils. The same government's Every Child Matters Change for Children agenda was launched in 2003 to promote the well-being of children and young people. Ministers wanted to ensure that every child had the support he or she needed to stay healthy, be safe, achieve economically, make a positive contribution to society and enjoy life. Not unreasonable, and I'm sure the Minister would agree. Healthcare practitioners, social workers, early year practitioners and other agencies shared information about vulnerable children. The child was central to their plans, and partners regularly worked with them in an attempt to achieve the best possible outcomes for them. Sadly, the coalition government brought these programmes to an end in 2010. Secondly, the union representatives suggested that pupil referral units should play a greater part in early intervention and prevention. In the past, PRUs engaged in in-reach work with mainstream schools to try to prevent exclusions from happening in the first place. Unfortunately, this is no longer happening due to funding cuts, which mean that PRUs are only able to perform their statutory minimum duty. I intervened on the Honourable Member for Bolton West's adjournment debate on funding for pupil referral units last week to raise this point about funding for in-reach work. And although the Minister went some way towards addressing it, I hope that the other Minister tonight might be able to give a fuller response this evening. The third point which came out of the consultation meeting was a need for inclusive accountability. It was suggested that schools could be held accountable for every student which walks through their doors in Year 7. Whilst this could potentially cause some problems with schools refusing to take perceived pupils in the first place, it would address the problem of off-rolling in GCSE years in an attempt to improve their results. Now, this clearly links in with the proposed changes to the Ofsted framework that I mentioned earlier. Finally, the unions highlighted the need to build resilience in young teachers, especially regarding how to cope with behavioural issues and violence. Behavioural management should be a higher priority in teacher training programmes. At present, trainees are given inadequate guidance on how to support and manage behaviour. In conclusion, Mr Speaker, I'm asking the Minister's Department to consider conducting a fundamental review of how funding for alternative provision is best spent. As I stated earlier in this speech, the Youth Violence Commission's findings ultimately point towards achieving zero exclusions. However, the Commission notes that this is a long-term goal and that smaller steps need to be achieved along the way. Primary school teachers frequently tell me that they can identify which of their pupils are likely to be involved in future violence. The current system is failing too many of those children, and it simply has to change. And I'll just finish with a few words from one of the young people who attended our evidence session. I didn't get a lot of support at school. I just got moved from place to place, and I didn't have a mentor to be able to talk to about my problems. I basically grew up in prison. I went when I was 15. Now, I hope the Minister agrees that this is categorically not the outcome that we want for our vulnerable young people. And I hope that the Minister can address some of these points I've raised during my speech.
I call the Minister of State at the Department for Education, Mr Nick Gibbs, to reply.
Very much, Mr Speaker. Can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Lewisham-Deptford on securing this debate and on her opening speech, and to pay tribute to her for her work as Chair of the Youth Violence Commission. Over the last year, too many young people have lost their lives as a result of violence, including 14-year-old Jaden Moody just a few weeks ago. Tackling this issue is a priority, and we know the impact of these tragic incidents is devastating for both families and friends of those concerned. This isn't a matter that can be tackled in isolation, which is why the Serious Violence Task Force was established by the government in April last year. Chaired by the Home Secretary, this brings together cross-party MPs, police leaders, local government and the voluntary sector with the aim of ensuring sustained and decisive action is taken against violent crime. The government's serious violence strategy, published in April 2018, signals a step change in the government's approach, not solely focused on law enforcement, important as that is, but also on a multi-agency approach across a number of sectors such as education, health and social services. Early intervention and prevention are at the core of the strategy, which is why the Home Office has established the Early Intervention Youth Fund, and through the fund 29 projects in England and Wales have been awarded a total of £17.7 million over 2 years to divert children and young people away from violent crime. Now, there is an important role that schools play in the safeguarding of pupils. Schools and colleges, including alternative provision referred to by the Honourable Lady, have a statutory obligation to safeguard and promote the welfare of their pupils. Now, the Department has very clear guidance set out in Keeping Children Safe in Education and Working Together to Safeguard Children guidance, which sets out what schools and colleges should and must do to implement their obligations and how agencies should work together to ensure the welfare of children. Now, the Department has worked with the Home Office and the police and Ofsted and the Health and Safety Executive to produce new school security guidance, which makes explicit reference to the serious issue of knife crime. Now, we've also created a resource for teachers so they can raise awareness about the dangers of knife crime among young people, and this complements the national knife crime media campaign that has been launched, #KnifeFree, to raise awareness of the consequences of knife crime. Now, equally critical in safeguarding children is the role of social care, and evidence from joint targeted area inspections of local authorities has shown that children who have grown up neglected are vulnerable to exploitation as adolescents. And that's why my department is improving the quality of children's social care services, including through an £84 million investment in strengthening families and protecting children, as well as establishing a new national response unit to help local authorities support vulnerable children at risk of criminal and sexual exploitation, including county lines and other forms of gang involvement and sexual exploitation. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. Firstly, can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Lewisham Deptford for securing this adjournment debate and the tireless work that I know she has put in driving forward the work of the Youth Violence Commission. Would my honourable friend agree with me that education, local government and health all have a part to play in diverting young people away from serious violence, and that whilst it might be the Ministry of Justice that makes the savings when we divert them from prison and criminality, we should look at some way of recycling the savings back into those areas of government upstream of the problem so that we can keep young people safe and out of trouble.
Yes, my honourable friend makes a very important point. It's why the task force was established in the first place, to make sure we weren't operating in silos and that those sort of funding issues didn't prevent the action that we know needs to be taken. Now, we know that children needing help and protection from social care, those with a social worker, not only lack safety and stability, but often have very poor educational outcomes, including being more likely to be excluded than other pupils. Now, the Children in Need review aims to understand what works in helping those vulnerable children to reach their potential. Now, moving on to the important issue of pupil behaviour and the related matter of schooling exclusions, this government is committed to ensuring that all teachers are equipped with the skills to tackle both the serious behavioural issues that compromise the safety and well-being of pupils and school staff, as well as the low-level disruption that too often gets in the way of effective teaching. It is vital that all schools are safe and disciplined environments. But there is more to be done, and that's why this government is investing £10 million to create behaviour hubs to facilitate the sharing of best practice in classroom and behaviour management. Now, we've also strengthened teachers' powers to discipline pupils. Teachers can now take action on poor behaviour which takes place outside of school, and we've also clarified teachers' powers to use reasonable force, and they have stronger powers to search pupils for items that could be used to cause harm or break the law, and teachers can issue now same-day detentions. Now, parents also have a fundamental role to play and are often well placed to support schools with the early identification of any problems which may be influencing a child's behaviour. And the SEND Code of Practice, for example, sets out that schools should work with parents to identify any underlying problems that might be related to their behavioural issues. Now, any form of violence in schools is unacceptable. Schools' behaviour policies should set out how poor behaviour, including incidents of violence, are dealt with. Now, should the incident constitute a criminal offence, of course, the school should report it to the police. Now, all children have the right to a school environment that is safe and conducive to education, and I fully support, and the government fully supports, head teachers in using exclusion where it is warranted. Exclusion on any grounds other than behaviour is unlawful, but it is for the head teacher to take this decision based on the evidence available and the need to balance the interests of the excluded pupil against those of the whole school community. Now, there is in recent media coverage some misinformed conflation of fixed-term exclusions with permanent exclusions. The statutory guidance on exclusions makes clear that in all cases a decision to permanently exclude a pupil should be taken only in response to a serious breach or persistent breaches of a school's behaviour policy, and if allowing the pupil to remain in school would seriously harm the education or welfare of others in the school. But exclusion from school must not mean exclusion from education. When a child is excluded, suitable full-time education has to be arranged from the 6th school day of exclusion. Now, there are differences in exclusion rates between schools, between different local authority areas of the country, and pupils with different characteristics, despite all state-funded schools in England operating under the same exclusions framework. And this is why last spring the government launched an externally led review of exclusions practice led by our former colleague Edward Timpson, which is due to be published shortly. And this will examine the factors that drive those differences, and they will also explore and evaluate best practice for those where the disparities are less significant. Now, regarding the potential links between exclusions and crime that the Honourable Lady mentioned in her opening remarks, it is correct that children who have been excluded from school are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. A recent study found that 23% of young offenders sentenced in 2014 to less than 12 months in custody had been permanently excluded from school prior to their sentence date. But while there is some correlation between exclusion and crime, we do not have evidence to suggest a causal link. What we do know is that there are children who face difficult circumstances where complex and multiple vulnerabilities can damage their outcomes, falling behind others from the early years onwards. Of pupils in 2016-17, approximately 1 in 10 needed a social worker over the previous 6 years. And of these, 35% also had special educational needs, 42% also claimed free school meals, and 17% faced all 3 disadvantages. Now, the compounding impact of these children's vulnerability on their educational attainment can be entrenched by poor experiences in education, including exclusion. Now, the Ministry of Justice did publish some analysis last June which looked at the educational background of young offenders who had committed a knife offence, and it was not possible to identify whether there is an association between exclusions and knife possession offending. Whilst a higher proportion of offenders had been persistently absent or excluded from school, only a very small proportion committed the knife possession offence shortly after being excluded from school. Around 74% of offenders committed the offence greater than 1 year after being permanently excluded. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, exclusion from school must not mean exclusion from education, and alternative provision is the system that is in place to educate those pupils who are unable to attend mainstream school. This could be for a variety of reasons, be it behavioural or following on from exclusion. Now, there are some excellent examples of alternative provision that not only have high standards of behaviour, progress and attainment, but also have strong interventions in place to support their pupils at risk of involvement in crime. For example, the London East alternative provision has an ethos of high expectations on pupils' results, outcomes and behaviour, and they don't accept an excuse culture among staff or pupils. Now, this is why our concern about alternative provision, of course, is not that type of provision is not widespread necessarily right across the country, and we are determined to make sure that every alternative provision setting is as good as the best in the country, and for the best practice to be shared. And that's why we're taking forward an ambitious programme of reform to alternative provision system over the coming months and years, which we believe will deliver sustained improvement. As we set out in our vision document published last March, our objective is to make sure that the right children are placed in the right alternative provision, that they receive a high-quality education, and that they achieve meaningful outcomes after leaving alternative provision. Now, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, and in closing this debate, I want to assure the Honourable Member for Lewisham Deptford that this government is determined to do everything it can to break the deadly cycle of violence that devastates the lives of individuals, families and communities. And in doing this, it is vital to develop a truly effective multi-agency approach to tackle the root causes of violence. We need to continue to work together so that every young person is safe and free to fulfil their potential away from violence.
Thank you. Order. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.